I didn't say a word. I didn't look away. I just stood there at the edge of the room, holding my glass of sparkling water, and smiled at my brother like he hadn't just made me the punchline of a joke in front of 200 people. He had. But I had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Longer than he knew. My name is Claire Merritt. I'm 34 years old, and I run a company called Ironwood Craft Co, a chain of custom woodworking and home restoration workshops with 14 locations across 8 states. We employ over 300 people, most of them tradespeople, who, like me, never finished a 4-year degree. Last year, we brought in just over $9 million in revenue. My brother Daniel doesn't know any of that. At least, he didn't. Not until his wedding day. Let me tell you how we got there. I grew up in a town called Mill Haven, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your father's name before they know yours. My father, Thomas Merritt, was a well-regarded civil engineer who spent 30 years designing bridges and overpasses across the Midwest. He was respected. He was precise. He believed, with the same rigidity he applied to load calculations and stress tolerances, that success had only one shape. A 4-year university degree, followed by a professional credential, followed by a respectable job with a title people recognized at dinner parties. Daniel fit that shape perfectly. He was 6 years older than me, and he had followed the path my father laid out like he was born walking it. Ohio State. MBA from Indiana University. By 30, he was a regional manager at a logistics firm in Columbus, the kind of job that came with a company car and a business card that impressed my father's golf partners. I did not fit that shape. I was not academic in the way my father valued. I wasn't careless or unintelligent. I just didn't absorb information the way school demanded. I learned with my hands. I could look at a broken cabinet hinge and understand instinctively how to fix it. I could walk into a room and see the bones of it, what was wrong, what could be better, what a space could become with the right work. My shop teacher, Mr. Hessler, told me when I was 16 that I had a rare kind of spatial intelligence. My father told me that shop class wouldn't pay the mortgage. My mother was different. Her name was Patricia, and she died when I was 19. A sudden cardiac event. No warning, no goodbye. She was the one who bought me my first set of chisels. She was the one who hung the little birdhouse I made in the 7th grade on the porch and never took it down. Not through wind or weather or my father's comments about how it was lopsided. She was the one who, a few months before she died, opened a savings account in my name with $11,000 she had quietly set aside over the years. She told me it was for whatever I needed it to be. A workshop, a truck, a start. She never got to see what I did with it. I found out, about 8 months after her funeral, that the account had been emptied. My father told me the money had been absorbed into estate costs. I was 20, grieving, still learning how to live in a world without her. And I didn't have the strength to push back. I believed him because I needed to believe that the man I had left in my life wouldn't steal from me. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't know how wrong for another 3 years, when my aunt, my mother's sister Margaret, let it slip at a Thanksgiving dinner that my father had used the money to co-sign a business loan for Daniel's first investment venture. A venture that, as it happened, paid off. Daniel had used that leverage, my mother's savings, my start, to build the first rung of his own ladder. Neither of them ever said a word to me about it. I left Mill Haven when I was 22 with a used pickup truck, $4,000 I had saved from 2 years of waitressing and weekend repair jobs, and a box of tools that had belonged to my mother's father. I drove to Knoxville, Tennessee, because I had a friend there with a spare room, and because I had seen an ad for a 6-month vocational certificate program in cabinetry and finish carpentry at a technical college. It cost $1,800. I enrolled the week I arrived. That program changed my life. Not because it taught me everything I needed to know. I already knew most of it in my hands, but because it gave me the credential that made people take me seriously enough to open a door. I started picking up small jobs through the school's contractor network. Kitchen refacing, built-in shelving, hardwood refinishing. I was fast, and I was careful, and I charged fair rates, and I showed up exactly when I said I would, which, I learned quickly, was rarer in my industry than it should have been. Within a year, I had more work than I could handle alone. I hired a part-time assistant, then a second. By the time I was 25, I had registered Ironwood Craft Co. as an LLC, leased a small workshop space, and started teaching weekend classes in basic woodworking. The classes were almost an afterthought, a way to fill slow Saturdays, but they took off in a way I hadn't expected. People were hungry for them. Young professionals who lived in renovated apartments and had never held a hand plane. Retirees who wanted to build something with their time. Veterans who needed the quiet focus of working with their hands. I had waiting lists within 3 months. I reinvested everything. Every dollar that didn't go to payroll or materials went back into the business. I opened a second location in Nashville at 27. A third in Asheville. By 30 I had 6. By 32, 12. I brought in a business partner, a woman named Renata, who had an MBA and a mind like a steel trap for operations, and together we scaled in a way that would have taken me twice as long alone. I did not call my father during any of this. I sent him a card at Christmas and on his birthday, and he occasionally replied with a brief note that asked when I was going to settle down and get a real job. I stopped expecting warmth from him a long time ago. What I had not quite stopped expecting, I think, was acknowledgement. The quiet hope that one day he might look at what I had built and see something worth seeing. Daniel got engaged to a woman named Stephanie in the spring of my 33rd year. Stephanie was pleasant enough in the way of people who are performing pleasantness, rather than feeling it always the right word, always the right smile, always watching to see if you'd noticed. She came from a family in suburban Columbus with money and opinions, and her parents' approval was the kind that came attached to conditions you weren't told about until you'd already failed to meet them. The wedding invitation arrived with a handwritten note from Daniel. It said he hoped I'd come, that it had been too long. That family was family. I stared at that note for a long time. I thought about my mother's $11,000. I thought about every Christmas I had driven back to Mill Haven and sat at a dinner table where my father talked about Daniel's promotions and asked me politely but pointedly whether I was still doing the furniture thing. I RSVP'd yes. I wasn't sure why, except that somewhere under the years of distance, there was still a person in me who wanted to believe that things could be different. Or maybe I just needed to finally close a door properly instead of just walking away from it. I drove to Columbus in early October. The wedding was at a venue outside the city, a converted barn, which I noticed with some private amusement had been beautifully restored. The original timber frame exposed and sanded to a warm honey finish, the kind of work I would have been proud to put my name on. I arrived the evening before for the rehearsal dinner, which was held at my father's house. He had remodeled the kitchen since I'd last been home. Cherry cabinets, quartz countertops, new hardwood floors throughout the main level. Good work. Not my work, but good. I walked through and quietly assessed the craftsmanship the way I couldn't help but do in any room, and for a moment the old house felt almost neutral, just a space, just wood and stone and light, without all the weight that came with it. My father greeted me in the front hallway with a handshake, not a hug. A handshake, brief and practiced, the way he might greet a vendor at a work function. He looked well. He had aged into the distinguished version of himself, the kind of man whose gray hair seemed intentional, whose posture still carried the authority of a person used to being listened to. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had long since learned to read, a quick inventory, assessing, finding me acceptable enough for the occasion. "Claire," he said, "you look well. Still in Tennessee?" "Still in Tennessee," I said. He nodded and moved on to greet someone else. Daniel found me by the bar 20 minutes later. He was in good spirits, loose with wedding eve adrenaline, and he hugged me with what felt like genuine warmth, the kind that surfaces in people before big events, when they're briefly suspended above the ordinary mechanics of who they are. We talked for a while. He asked about the business, and I gave him the abbreviated version I always gave, the version that was vague enough not to invite questions I didn't want to answer. He nodded along the way people do when they're listening to the words, but not quite to the meaning. Stephanie's father, a man named Gerald, gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner. It was the kind of toast that was ostensibly about the couple, but was mainly about Gerald, his achievements, his family's legacy, his delight in welcoming such a promising young man as Daniel into the fold. He mentioned Daniel's MBA twice and his current position once, and used the phrase built from nothing in a way that suggested he meant it as a compliment, but was primarily measuring the distance Daniel had covered to reach his daughter. I sat at a table near the back with two of my mother's cousins I barely knew, and a colleague of Stephanie's who spent the evening on her phone. I ate the chicken and drank my water and watched my father laugh at Gerald's jokes from across the room. The wedding the next day was beautiful in the way of events that have been very carefully planned. The barn was everything the night before, couldn't be warm, light, wildflowers, the smell of cedar and autumn coming through the open doors. I sat in the third row on Daniel's side and watched my brother marry a woman he clearly loved. And whatever complicated feelings I carried into that venue, they didn't touch the simple fact of that. He was happy. I was glad for him in the way you can be glad for someone while still carrying the full weight of everything that stands between you. The reception was when it happened. We were an hour in. Dinner had been served. The toasts had come. Gerald again, a college friend of Daniel's who was funny and brief, Stephanie's maid of honor who cried beautifully and on cue. Then my father stood up. I hadn't known he was going to speak. It wasn't on the program. He had apparently asked the DJ for the microphone and been given it, because he was my father and he was Thomas Merritt, and people gave him things when he asked for them. He spoke warmly about Daniel for the first few minutes. His work ethic, his drive, how proud he was to see his son become the man he'd raised him to be. The room was with him, 200 people who had eaten well and drunk enough to be generous with their attention. My father had always known how to hold a room. Then he said he wanted to acknowledge the whole family. He looked across the tables and named a few people, an uncle, a cousin, a family friend who had apparently known Daniel since Little League. And then he looked in my direction and he smiled. The particular smile of a man about to say something he found amusing, and he said, "And of course my daughter Claire is here, all the way from Tennessee. Claire has always done things her own way, never needed a degree, never needed a career plan. She does, what is it, Claire, wood stuff?" He chuckled. "I always say, one of my kids got the ambition and one of them got the sawdust. But we love her anyway." He laughed. Gerald laughed. Several people at the tables near the front laughed because my father was laughing and it seemed like the thing to do. I didn't laugh. I didn't flinch. I held my glass very still and I breathed very slowly, and I looked at my father and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me with its cleanness, this is the last time. Not the last time I would see him, necessarily. The last time I would absorb this. The last time I would sit in a room full of people and let myself be reduced to a punchline by a man who had never once asked what I had actually built. Daniel was watching me from the head table. His expression was complicated, embarrassed, maybe, or apologetic, but not enough of either to move him to say something. Stephanie was looking at her champagne. My father handed the microphone back to the DJ and returned to his seat, still smiling. I set down my glass. I smoothed the front of my dress. And then I stood up. I didn't have a microphone. I didn't need one. I walked to the small platform at the front of the room where the wedding party was seated, and I asked the DJ politely if I could borrow the mic for 60 seconds, and he looked at me, and then at the room, and then handed it over. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something unscheduled happens. "I'm Claire," I said, "Daniel's sister. I want to say congratulations to my brother and Stephanie genuinely. I'm glad to be here." I paused. "Dad mentioned that I do wood stuff." "That's accurate. I also do tile, finish carpentry, historic restoration, and workforce training for skilled tradespeople. I do those things at 14 locations across 8 states. We had just over $9 million in revenue last year, and we're on track to hit 12 next year. We employ 317 people, most of whom are exactly the kind of people my father's generation told that a vocational path wasn't good enough. I was not angry when I said it. I want to be clear about that. My voice was level. My hands were steady. I had spent enough years in spaces where people underestimated me that I knew how to say true things without the trembling that makes people think you're asking for something. I wasn't asking for anything. "I didn't come here to make a speech," I said. "I came here because Daniel is my brother, and this is his wedding, and I love him. But I also came here because I have spent a long time being the family joke, and I think tonight is a good night to let that go." I set the microphone gently on the edge of the platform. "Congratulations, Daniel. Stephanie." I wish you every happiness. I walked back to my table. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone near the back began to clap one of my mother's cousins, the older one, a woman named Ruth, who had watched my mother set aside that money years ago and had apparently never forgotten it. A few more people joined. Not a standing ovation. Not a movie moment. Just the sound of people recalibrating. I sat down. My table mate, Stephanie's colleague, looked up from her phone for the first time all night and said, "Wait, you have 14 locations?" 14, I said. My father did not look at me for the rest of the evening. Daniel came to find me near the end of the night, when the dancing was winding down and the lights had gone soft and golden. He looked like a man who had been having a very good day and had been given something complicated to carry. He sat down across from me, and for a moment he didn't say anything. "I didn't know," he said finally, "about how big it had gotten. I knew you were doing well, but I didn't." "I know you didn't," I said. "Dad shouldn't have said that." Another pause. "I know about the money," he said. "Mom's savings. I've known for a long time." I looked at him. "I've been trying to figure out how to..." He stopped. I should have said something. Years ago. I've wanted to. It's not an excuse. I had imagined this conversation in different versions over the years. In some of those versions I was cold. In others I said things I didn't mean and then had to live with having said them. In the version I had prepared the longest, I was entirely closed the door that had been shut and painted over and was no longer recognizable as a door. But I was sitting in a barn that smelled like cedar, at the wedding of my brother, who had just told me something true that cost him something to say. And I thought about my mother and the birdhouse on the porch that she never took down. I thought about the way she had told me, when I was 17 and furious at something I can't even remember now, that you have to decide which things you're going to carry and which ones you're going to set down, and that the decision doesn't mean the thing didn't happen. It just means you chose not to carry it forever. "Thank you for telling me," I said. Daniel nodded. His eyes were wet and he was trying not to show it, which was so like him even now, even in a moment that deserved the feeling. He was bracing against it. "I'd like to pay you back," he said. "The 11,000. I have it. I've had it set aside for Daniel a while. I want to." I thought about it. It wasn't the money. It had never really been the money. But I also knew that it was important to him, that there was something he needed to do in order to live inside his own skin a little easier. "Donate it," I said. "There's a foundation I work with in Knoxville. They provide scholarships and tools for people going into skilled trades. Donate it in Mom's name." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, that's right." We sat there for a while without talking, the two of us, in the warm light of a restored barn, listening to the last slow song of the night play out. It wasn't resolution, exactly. Some things aren't resolved. They're just carried differently. My father called me 3 days after the wedding. I was in my workshop in Knoxville when my phone rang, and I looked at the screen and saw his name, and I sat with it through several rings. I answered, "Claire." His voice was its usual register, measured, controlled, the voice of a man who did not easily arrive at uncertainty. "I've been thinking about what you said at the reception." "All right," I said. A pause. "I didn't realize the scope of what you had built." "I know you didn't." Another pause, longer. "I should have asked." Those 3 words "I should have asked" were probably as close as my father was going to get to an apology, at least in that phone call. I understood that. I had long since stopped expecting from him the kind of language that came naturally to people who were practiced in vulnerability. He was a man of structures and systems, and an admission like that had the quality of a load-bearing beam shifting. You didn't push further without understanding what might come down. "You could ask now," I said. And he did. He asked about the business, and I told him about it. Not the abbreviated version, the real one. He was quiet and attentive, and asked the kind of specific questions that I recognized came from the engineering mind he had. How do you manage quality across 14 locations? What's your supply chain for reclaimed materials? How do you train for consistency without losing the craft? He had never once asked me questions like that. In an hour on the phone, I had the strange and disorienting experience of talking to my father about my work, as though I were a person he was meeting for the first time. "You should be proud of what you've done," he said at the end of the call. I didn't tell him how long I had waited to hear something like that. It didn't seem like the right moment. Maybe there would be another conversation, another day. Something built slowly the way all solid things are built. Thank you, I said. After I hung up, I sat in my workshop for a while. The late afternoon light was coming through the high windows the way it does in October, long and angled, catching the dust in the air, making the grain of the wood on the workbench glow. I had a chair in progress, a commission for a family in Chattanooga, 3 weeks of careful work in the joints and the spindles and the curve of the back. I picked up my spokeshave and ran my hand along the wood and thought about my mother. She had always known, I think, what I was capable of. Not because she had seen the 14 locations or the revenue numbers or the 317 employees. She knew before any of that. She knew when I was 12 years old, building something lopsided on the garage floor. Because she was the kind of person who watched the way you worked instead of the thing you produced. And she saw something in the way I worked that told her enough. I still have the first chisel she gave me. It lives in a leather roll in the top drawer of my tool chest. And I don't use it anymore, not for work, not for anything. I just keep it there. Some things you don't carry as a burden. You carry them as a reminder that someone saw you clearly and loved exactly what they saw. That's what I've tried to build all these years. Not to prove something to my father or to Daniel or to anyone who laughed at a wedding reception. Not to become the kind of success story that turns heads at dinner parties. I built it because my mother once handed me a chisel and said, "Show me what you can do." And I have spent every year since trying to be worthy of the way she asked. I'm still trying. I think that's the right way to do it. If you've ever been the person in your family who didn't fit the shape they expected, who loved the wrong thing, took the wrong path, built something they couldn't put on a resume, I want you to know that the shape they had in mind was never the only one. It was just the one they knew. There are other shapes. Build yours.